Here we are for the Communicating Climate Change via Art and Science panel discussion. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Gimoy, Wallabara, Yidinji and Yirraganji people. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We have 5 excellent panellists here, all coming from very diverse and different backgrounds, to discuss a pretty interesting topic, and I'm facilitating the discussion. My name's Adam and I'm an ABC radio presenter. For the last couple of decades I've worked around regional Australia sharing the stories of people, interviewing scientists and artists about their distinctly different work, so it's going to be interesting tonight to merge the two fields. And the person whose works are actually stimulating all the discussion is Yandell Walton, and Yandell is going to tell us a little bit more about herself now.
Hi Adam. So I am a Melbourne-based artist, working predominantly with moving image installation, utilising projection to create immersive works that investigate ideas around impermanence.
To our next guest now. Katie Chartrand is a scientist. Katie, a senior researcher at the Centre for Tropical Water and Aquatic Ecosystems. And Katie, you can tell us a little bit more about what you do at James Cook University.
Thanks, Adam. So I've been working for the last 18 years in tropical coral and seagrass ecosystems, really looking at habitats at risk. And that's here along Australia's coast, some of those acute risks from impacts such as dredging and coastal development, but also looking at some of those bigger long-term impacts that are more prevalent, like climate change today. So we help lead a number of programs, some which are really developing partnerships across industries and collaborating with others to drive that really impactful and applied research outcome. So it's not just doing the science of research for science sake, but really about how we can implement that into management strategies and have impacts on the ground. The most latest work has really been working with some of the great partners here tonight, Andy Ridley at Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef, developing some of the programs we'll talk a bit further about called the Great Reef Census. I'll leave that for later.
Excellent. Well, from a scientist to an urban planner, we're going to hear from Lisa Law now. Lisa, tell us more about what you do.
I feel like I'm a little bit between the science and the art, actually. I'm a lecturer in urban planning and design at James Cook University, and mostly my research has been about quality public spaces and creating good public realms, but also it seems to be turning into looking at how we can design cities to respond to climate change. And I think that's partly because if you look at the next 3 decades of urbanization on the planet, that urbanization will happen in the tropical world. So there's opportunities to design that well and creatively with the future in mind. So I'm a lecturer in planning and urban design, but I'm also the founder and chair of our Tropical Urbanism and Design Lab at JCU because I know I can't solve these problems by myself. And I've created a team of people who are from industry, government, and the university to work together on these issues. And we do project work, we do education, and we do advocacy.
Lucas Cernusak is an associate professor in the College of Science and Engineering at James Cook University, also with the Centre for Tropical Environment and Sustainability Science. Lucas, tell us more.
Thanks, Adam. So I'm a tropical forest ecologist, and more specifically, I study tree physiology. So really, the processes that sustain trees and allow them to live and grow. And of course, I spend a lot of my time thinking about climate change, how that can affect these processes, and doing experiments to try to understand that further, and making observations in the tropical rainforests around Cairns. So it's a great place to work, and excited to be here for this conversation.
Andy Ridley is co-founder and founding CEO of the global movement Earth Hour. And these days, he is CEO of the Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef movement. Andy, tell us more.
Well, nice to be here. Yeah, I guess I've been working on climate change for about 20 years now. Oh my God. And the current project that I'm working on with people like Katie and lots of others in Cairns and across the Great Barrier Reef is Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef. And as Katie said, we'll talk a bit about it later, but we're really interested in in how you can mobilize very large numbers in very practical application of conservation across an ecosystem like the Great Barrier Reef, and how you can utilize assets, whether they're on the reef or around the world, to scale that up.
And Torres Webb joins us. Torres, a science advocate and leader, a proud Far North Queenslander and Indigenous man from the Torres Strait. Torres?
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. It's great to be here and to join you all and join everyone together for the panel. Yes, as you described there, I'm an environmental scientist and also an educator. A lot of my work's based around ways that how we can really value the contributions, knowledges, and deep understandings and wisdoms of our First Peoples here in Australia, particularly around how we best look after our environment and particularly around educating the wider Australian public around the deep science knowledges that have been continuing to be utilised here in this country, Australia. Thank you.
Okay, well, Yandell, your exhibition, Shifting Surrounds, recently shown here at Northside. It visually communicates elements of climate change across multiple installations. Tonight we're going to look at 4 of your works from that exhibition and discuss with the panel in regard to each of their fields of work. But first, can you tell us a little bit about this exhibition?
Yes, so the recent exhibition, Shifting Surrounds, is a series of installations. It was originally created for the Substation Gallery in Melbourne in 2019 and then redeveloped for Northside Contemporary to exhibit up in Cairns in 2021. The exhibition was actually conceived in 2017, 2018 when the climate crisis was really at the forefront of the media. My work is very personal, I suppose. It's really kind of presenting concerns about what I am thinking about or feeling. So this work was really a culmination of what was worrying me about climate change. So the work was a really kind of creative way for me to unpack concerns like rising sea levels, overconsumptive behaviours, plastic and waste pollution, and I suppose our reliance on technology. Within the exhibition, there were five major works that I redeveloped and installed at Northside Contemporary. And the first one, Uprise, that you can see now, I created a 3D computer-generated wave that engulfs the walls of a gallery. So this work could be kind of read as a tidal wave or a tsunami or perhaps even massive floodwaters. This work for me really fleshes out the immense power of nature and the environment. The wave literally takes over the human-made, the architectural space that the viewer is standing in. I feel like I've always felt oceans to be immensely powerful. So with Uprise, I really wanted to reflect that power, but I also wanted to reflect the powerlessness we as humans could feel with climate crisis effects like rising sea levels that can displace entire communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Wonderful work as well. Katie, we might bring you into the discussion here. Tell us about your research on coral and seagrass ecosystems and what effect rising temperatures and sea levels are having on these critical habitats.
Sure. So seagrasses, I guess to start with, I mean, they're two really functionally important parts of what we call our Great Barrier Reef. People think of it as the reef and the coral, the component of that. Seagrasses are equally a part of the connectivity that makes that full ecosystem function and work holistically. And seagrasses are actually really at risk in very different ways to some of those conversations you hear about for coral and coral reefs. We have warming temperatures, obviously having direct impacts on those coral communities. It stresses out that symbiotic relationship that's so critical to those animals to function. And what we see with seagrasses, while they can withstand some of those climate impacts related to temperature fairly well at this stage, we see other problems with increasing storm activity, increasing cyclones. There's some amazing imagery out of Cairns right here on our esplanade, where we're monitoring as part of our long-term programs and looking at that spatial footprint. We have this long-term data set showing where we have these more La Nina events, when you have more of these big cyclone systems that have come through and wiped out these seagrass meadows, and the timeframes to get that recovery, which is natural. We have these natural events. Can take almost 10 years for those meadows to come back. So if we're starting to have increasing frequency of these events, which is predicted with climate change, the chances for that recovery is potentially lost. And the on-flow effects are significant. I mean, our fisheries rely on these. Our megafauna, turtles and dugong, this is their sole food supply. Back around the big cyclone Yasi and systems that caused that crash here in Cairns, we saw quite a number of dugong and turtle washing up. So the impacts were quite dramatic.
It was an incredible slide we just saw there. Was that detailing what happened post-Yasi?
That's right. So we could track with our annual monitoring and watching that what normally was a fairly stable seagrass meadow and the footprint there off the esplanade really, completely get decimated and fall out over a number of years post-event. And, we were quite concerned and starting to look at ways that we might need to intervene. But over time, the meadow did return. It has recovered back to quite healthy levels. But the concern is that that's not necessarily going to be able to keep up in the future if you have a cyclone coming through, or even just major storm events wiping out some of these inshore ecosystems, habitats at risk, their long-term trajectory, and, the trophic food web that they support is really at risk too. And so that becomes a problem for the greater reef system. The other big value with seagrasses that is becoming a bit more of, in the public eye is about the potential for them to store carbon. We talk about these important, blue carbon stocks. So they have the potential to store a lot of that, value in terms of locking away that energy. And we're only now starting to understand that these things are incredibly valuable, especially when you put a dollar value on them. So to protect them, they have all kinds of ecosystem function and ecosystem values that go beyond just the ecological ones or the biological ones for those other animals. So seagrasses are obviously something that don't get a lot of attention, but are very much at risk as we talk about climate change.
You did mention earlier that you and Andy have been working on a project, and we'll bring Andy into the discussion now, a massive project, the Great Barrier Reef census. Andy, I understand the need to rapidly and massive scale up conservation efforts in this decade of change, but can you tell us about its mission, this Great Barrier Reef census, and its progress and its potential?
Yeah, so when after we had those sequential bleachings in 2016 and 2017 across the reef and across reefs around the world, there was a conference held down in Townsville, and they were talking about, what are the gaps that are missing. There are massive information gaps missing on the Great Barrier Reef in terms of what's going on. And because things are changing year by year, the need to get that kind of more current, almost like reconnaissance information, images from as many of the key source reefs, the most important reefs within the system, becomes more and more important in terms of how do you manage the reef system. Basically, what's happening at the moment in parallel is we need to get emissions to plummet globally, and we need to do everything we can to build resilience within the system to basically last long enough for humanity to get its act together. So it's quite two parallel tracks, both fairly seriously difficult to do. So what we were trying to do with census was to start to fill some of those data gaps, get more information off the reef in the form of photographs. And, we don't have $1 billion to do it. So we basically organized a kind of motley flotilla of super yachts and fishing boats and dive boats and tourism boats and recreational boats and anybody that could help to get out there and start taking images from as far and as wide as we could from far up in the north all the way down into the Swains in the south. And, we didn't know if it would work, and I came to see you about it when we were trying to get it going. But actually it was incredible. Like hundreds of people got involved. We had 40 vessels across the reef system. We captured 13,000 images, got to 680 sites, a really big effort. And then in terms of the analysis of those images, we got citizens all over the world to help start to analyze those images. So we had 6,000 people. We built a platform for people to go through and analyze what was being seen. What's probably more interesting or maybe exciting about all of this is this was a one mission thing. We were trying to get this reconnaissance information, but actually what we're really trying to work out is, can you mobilize or use all these different assets to scale up conservation? So this is one thing we're going to try and do. With Great Reef Census 2, we'll try and add more missions. We're going to do a whole lot of surveying around seagrass, which, as Katie said, is like really important.
I think one of the really exciting things about the Great Reef Census too is, Yandell has highlighted with their art, some of these really things that kind of stop you in your tracks to the point where, you feel, what can I do? You feel helpless. And this is something that brings the positive back. It's the inspiration to say, this is something little I can do wherever I am in the world, whether it's analyzing those photos or going out on the reef. If you're here to help collect those images, it feels like you can give back and do something to have impact. So we have a better way to manage, that ecosystem that we still do have there.
And when you're trying to facilitate mass change, Yandell's beautifully captured image of the relentless fury of the pounding waves of the rising ocean. Is that what it feels like sometimes when you're trying to initiate something?
Well, Yandell, I thought it was it's a very cool piece of artwork. I wish I'd actually seen it in person. I would love to see it on scale. Well, there's two things to say. First one is that, we struggle to go beyond the people who already are engaged with us, right? So that's one of the great challenges with communicating any of this stuff, is to engage beyond those who already care, or those who will never care. You probably don't want to waste too much time on this big lot in the middle. So that's a really important part that I think we struggle with, right? And then I think that the second piece is, I don't know, with the ocean, it is an extremely powerful place, and sometimes it freaks you out, and sometimes it's, its power, but it's also a place of incredible kind of beauty. And I know we were on certain expeditions, but we had 40 or so expeditions going out there. Some of these places out on the reef were so beautiful. When you came out of the water, you didn't know whether you were going to cry or laugh, and some were not. Some were just, destroyed. So you've got this it's really nuanced.
And I guess part of the challenge for you is that if people feel like the cause is already lost, it's hard to get them to buy in.
Yeah.
With the global pandemic, we've seen that, what vaccines have been created in record time. When a lot of minds are put to a cause, solutions can be found that previously weren't there. Do you think there's anything you can glean from what we've seen with the pandemic for conservation?
It's a massive lesson for us that, if you look at something like climate change, pre-pandemic, people were talking about, global loss to the economy if you dealt with climate change have been, about 2% growth, right? And then you look at the pandemic and you're losing 20 or 30% in some countries, and even more in some countries. And so you look at it and you go, okay, well, humanity managed to essentially entirely change the global economy in 2 months. And we built or made vaccines in less than a year. And now we're vaccinating whole populations. And so you sort of look at this stuff and you go, humanity has the capacity to do extraordinary things if it has the desire and determination to do it. And with climate change, it's a slow burner in some ways, although it's getting quicker and quicker and quicker now. It's entirely fixable, though we've left it so late that, that fix becomes a massive task. But pandemic tells you humanity can do big things.
And it'd be silly of me not to ask about the parallels between trying to elicit change in Queensland and Australia. And Earth Hour did that too, but Earth Hour was a global movement.
Yeah.
Was it almost easier, Earth Hour as a concept, to actually take fire than something that requires maybe a bit more of a leap of faith for some people?
Yeah, Earth Hour was 2007, so there was no, the biggest social media platform then was MySpace. And, so in certain ways, you didn't have that communication capacity to connect behind a common purpose in the same way as we do now. Although it's a very much more crowded world that we live in. I think maybe to Yandell's point, though, the desire to actually have something tangible and credible that you can actually do is the missing piece in this puzzle. And I don't mean petition signing, they're often useful, but I mean, right, what are we going to do over the next 10 years to save everything? And I think that roadmap is really critical at every level: government, company, individual.
In the next work by Yandell titled Oblivion, we're going to see it here, a single orange juice carton floating in space, seemingly a remnant of human occupation. Yandell, it's an incredible image that you've created here. Can you elaborate on this work?
Yeah, sure. So Oblivion was inspired during a residency in Berlin, Germany, actually, where I was super impressed with the Germans' meticulous kind of recycling habits. Basically, most of the waste packaging in your household was cleaned, separated, and could be recycled, which is all amazing. But just because it can be recycled, it doesn't mean it has no footprint, right? Look at the Tetra Pak, for example. It is super problematic, as there's kind of there's layers of different materials, so aluminium, paper, plastic, that all need to be pulled apart and separated to then be recycled. So I think this work kind of looks at our overconsumptive behaviours and really asks us to reevaluate just how effective our waste management and recycling systems are, or efforts are, as individuals, but also globally. It would take more than a few people or even an entire country to try and clean up the plastic waste polluting our oceans, for example. There's such massive problems. So it was kind of looking at that extensive global issue.
Well, we might bring Lisa Law into the discussion as an urban planner. Lisa, what major changes do you see occurring or would need to occur to create a more sustainable, harmonious existence with the planet we live on?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And just great work, Yandell, which I found really inspiring, because I particularly like the way you were thinking about trees and concrete and water. And I think in lots of ways, this is what urban planning is about, is arranging those things in the city, and so that they are more sustainable and designed well. And I do feel between science and art, but I also feel between a rainforest and a reef. And I think that what most people don't realize is that those changes you discuss in our everyday life, like recycling, but actually building the cities that we live in, that's where a lot of the carbon emissions can be reduced. So if you look at the amount of concrete that goes into roads or buildings or that's true certainly here in Kansas. We've got population projections that we're going to grow here for the next couple of decades. But I think if you look at where, in 2007, the world reached that point where it became more urban than rural. And for the next 3 decades, urbanization will proceed apace, and we're going to build as much urbanism as we have, as from now until 2050, as we did since the beginning of civilization, right? So therein, we also have opportunities for change, right? So we need to design more sustainably. But I think a lot of the environmental thinkers are in the reef and in the rainforest and looking and measuring those real big impacts of what climate change is doing. But actually the city poses the promise of the most change. And it's those everyday, it's recycling. It's, did you design a neighborhood that you have to drive a car in? Or did you design one where you could walk somewhere? And it's the violence. I think what I liked about your exhibition, Yandell, is the way it portrayed the violence of urbanization. So I've been watching what's happening here in the northern beaches. And especially in Palm Cove, they rip down those forests. They don't even leave little pockets. We've got wallabies with no homes. You take the rivers and creeks and you stuff them in pipes underground or in concrete drains with fences up to the edges of them. They're actually incredibly dangerous places, but they're also not cleaning our stormwater before it goes to the Great Barrier Reef, right? And it's pushing all of the rubbish and the plastic bottles. If you're on the bridge in Saltwater Creek, you can almost count them go out to the reef every minute. So I think designing, so that's at the core of what we do in urban planning and design, is thinking, well, how can you design environments that are that neighborhoods that are responsive to the environment, at the same time as providing places where we feel uplifted, right? This is what urban planning it started as, to create these contexts for a good life. But if we're building, these destructive, if we're killing the habitat and nature, and then we're putting in these manicured, foreign species and getting rid of everything, it's just not a good way. And I think your art, to me, Yandell, really raises that and speaks to me as somebody who thinks about cities. And especially your concrete piece, which I thought, well, that would be really lovely to have at one of those drains as a sort of, instead of in a gallery, just reminding people the violence of urbanization.
I mean, sustainable development is happening, but you talked about the wallabies on the northern beaches of Cairns. We're not far from where a flying fox population has been moved out of the city because it became an existential threat to its existence that we'd built around it, and then we had to move it on. Otherwise, it wasn't going to be, well, depending on who you listen to, it wasn't going to be the best thing for the flying foxes. Is nature ever going to win when it comes to commercial interest? But also, people need to be able to afford to live in the environment that they're living in.
Yeah, well, those are two different questions, right? The bats are a really interesting case study, and the mass extinction event, pretty much, and with the heat wave in 2018, it was just sad. And I loved what CAFNEC did, and they put all those little crosses for the 23,000 flying foxes that died under that tree at the library. That was an amazing and quite powerful, moving thing to do. But the thing about flying foxes, you can't control them, right? They have their own will and agency, and you can't control where they're going to go. It was actually really good to have them here in the city, because during heat waves you can protect them. And I think
the community here in the city actually did better than the ones in some of the more semi-urban.
So only a couple of hundred died here, and like 11,000 died at Edmonton or something like that, because we can care for them if they're in the city. And, there are examples of architects who are designing structures where we can coexist with the bats and manage them. Like, there is a design solution in how we deal with the bats, and we've just chosen not to do that.
Torres, we might bring you into the conversation now. Torres Webb, let's discuss education, science and culture as tools to assist the next generation.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And it was lovely to hear all the conversation here of all the panelists, and Yandell, such fantastic art pieces. When I think about, this word STEM, and then you have STEAM, and it's the A for the art, it's actually a way of articulation and really communicating that science message. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, First Nations peoples, always have used art as a powerful tool. And really, when we think about the purpose and role of our community, it's really about educating our young. And for me, that's been a real strong passion for me, is utilizing that science as a tool and really going deeper into science and the whole practice. It's about inquiry. It's about really thinking and building that creative and critical thinking skills for our citizens of the future. Like was shared earlier, it's such a really important tool that we have our young people really knowledgeable and understand the current situation that we're in, to inform those decisions into the future and make those right moves to do the best that we can to look after what we have.
What do you think some of the benefits of using art to convey meaning around complex topics in science? So usually if we want to understand a complex topic, people will go to a textbook or maybe watch a video online. But with art, you're talking about kids that are actually conveying meaning. What kind of benefit do you see through the art side of things?
Yeah, I think the art is a really powerful tool, because it not only activates and makes you think about it, but really feel, like Yandell was explaining earlier. And it's such a real powerful tool that's visual for everyone to see, that it's not only in the mind, but touches the heart too. And
I mean, the Torres Strait is a community where we know that rising sea levels are already having impacts on some islands. That was the the inspiration for Yandell's first piece, but the second piece, a juice carton just floating into oblivion. We also know ocean pollution is a massive problem for the Torres Straits and for the world, really. What did you feel when you were seeing that picture, that oblivion picture of the carton just seemingly floating into oblivion?
Yeah, this climate change, it's real. It's happening right now here in our own backyard here in Australia. It's experienced yearly for our communities up in the Torres Strait, with that sea level rise and tidal inundation affecting many of the island communities throughout the Torres Strait. It's something that's of real pertinent to our people in the Torres Strait, that that things need to be done and changes need to happen. Further to that juice carton, and it made me think a bit more about some of the marine pollution. And one of my catchphrases is about how can we focus on what's strong and not only what's wrong. And what I found is fantastic about our First Nations people is the resiliency. And actually, a lot of our family members and art centres are utilising some of the marine debris to create beautiful artefacts, even with the school children. You see a beautiful picture there that really shows that what can we do, even if it's some small practical steps in our own communities. Here we're planting some fruit trees in the local community to hold the soil, but to also pass on some of that knowledge to the younger generation to inspire them and keep that hope for the future rather than just all that doom and gloom.
So we've seen two pretty incredible pieces of art from Yandell. We're going to now introduce a third piece. It's called Deadline, Yandell. Deadline, a countdown to 2030. Is that right?
That's correct, actually. And this work was actually conceived as the last installation in the series for Shifting Surrounds. Each of the other installations really was a very sort of creative response to climate crisis issues. And I feel like each work of the other works could really be interpreted in many ways, depending on what the individual viewer kind of brought to that work. Whereas this one is quite definite about what it's kind of talking about. For me, it was really important to kind of convey the alarming nature of the climate crisis and really kind of reference a point of no return or a tipping point. And yes, the countdown clock counts down the seconds, minutes, hours, and days to 2030, as that is the year the International Panel on Climate Change predicted a 1.5 degree increase in global warming above pre-industrial levels. And it's really interesting as well re-exhibiting this work over and over, I suppose, because that end date gets closer, obviously, each year. It's actually in the background here, counting down still. I'd be super interested to hear from some of the other panellists about what a 1.5 degree increase could do or would do to some of our ecosystems, and if we as a country are doing enough to help stop this increase, because it's counting down, literally.
Well, we'll bring Lucas into the conversation now, because you said you spend your time working in the rainforests and in the environment, assessing the impact of a changing environment on the ecosystems. What does that clock countdown mean to you?
Yeah. Thanks, Yandell. I think that's a really powerful kind of artistic expression. And I suppose for me, there's certainly this counting down, but then also, as we discussed, there are solutions, and trees are an integral part of that. So we have to lower our emissions, but we can also plant trees, restore forests, and they soak up carbon from the atmosphere. And so, yeah, I think there's certainly processes that are changing, and we see that in the rainforest. We see lots of impacts that are in some ways similar to the Great Barrier Reef, in some ways less punctuated in the way that they play out. But it's fascinating, and certainly the time for action is now. I think, yeah, we can't delay any longer.
I mean, and you think of the rainforest as being like a safe haven, if there was one on the planet, because they are usually wet. But in a changing climate, what threat is there to the rainforest in which you work?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. There's this sort of interplay between rising temperatures and increasing dryness of the atmosphere, increasing evaporative demand, but then also, because we are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that's the substrate for photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is going a little bit faster. And it's this super interesting kind of competing effect that we are understanding, but that are difficult to predict and will also depend on the trajectory of future climate change. But forests will feed back with our actions, with our activities, in a way that will have really important effects, for sure.
I mean, forests preceded us, and undoubtedly in a changing climate, some will thrive and some won't. What are your concerns around what we might see if we continue to exceed the levels at which scientists think it's safe?
Yeah, I think for us, kind of locally here in the wet tropics, we have a lot of tree species that grow, for example, only above 1,000 meters, so only in the cooler upland rainforests, and we really don't know what will happen to them when we go to a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase or 2 degrees increase, and it's difficult to predict. So we have to sort of have conservation efforts at the same time as trying to control the impacts of climate change.
And Katie, I mean, you're working on ecosystems not far from the rainforest, but completely different, ocean ecosystems. What did the clock countdown art piece mean to you?
Yeah, it's really powerful, Yandell. And I think, for coral reefs, they are somewhat iconic in terms of the impacts of warming, oceans warming worlds are doing. We know, it's accepted already. We've passed a point which we will lose coral. We will continue to lose coral cover on our reefs globally. Here on the Great Barrier Reef, it's predicted with that 1.5 degree warming that we will see corals go down to very low levels, not gone entirely. And then comes into play about how much can we intervene, how much can we look at some of these moonshot opportunities, which we've been exploring, some of those inspiration pieces, whether it's helping to put millions of coral babies, coral larvae back on the reef. We've been involved with trying to harness these big spawning events when those reproductive efforts happen out there. But we know that those are only really Band-Aid, right? We're getting back to, we have to cap emissions. We've got to cut emissions now. And the changes on those reef systems, as much as rainforests, you might not see them as much as stochastically as we see with the reef systems. We had the global mass bleaching events that led to a lot of dieback on reefs around the world during 2016 and 2017. So it's these really sharp events where you can see massive losses in the systems, compounded by those increasing storm activities and disturbances. So we're just not giving the system enough time to regain ground. And you compound that with ocean acidification and erosion of the reefs and some of these other complicating factors with climate change, and it gets a little bit scary. So 1.5 is definitely creating pressures on the system. And we're working hard now to look at how we can intervene and find inspirational pieces to make change. So there's lots of groups out there looking at moonshot opportunities, going, what can we do? It sounds crazy for the scale of the system, the size of Italy. How do we help here just on our Great Barrier Reef? But I think we luck out in some ways, some of those local pressures like water quality, which are definitely still a problem, but less so compared to places like in the Caribbean. There you see on the Florida Reef Track alone, they're down to 2% coral cover from 98% back in the 70s and 60s. And that's largely due to water quality impacts. But how can you restore a system if you can't remove some of those local pressures to even give it a chance going forward with climate change, or if there's nothing left? So Yeah, I think we have some luck on our side for the Great Barrier Reef, but globally, I mean, it looks scary, but now's the time for action and inspiration, which is what I think our work is really about.
I was thinking with you with the countdown, Yandell. There's this thing that I reckon I worry about anyway, which is you get this kind of target of 1.5. We think we're going to go over 1.5. It's pretty hard not to now, unless something magical happens. But there's this sort of danger in this stuff of going, okay, if you hit 1.5, then it's all over. Actually, what you're trying to, now we're in this sort of zone where even an increment, if you get to 1.6, it's better than 1.7. If you get to 1.7 instead of 1.8, we're in this zone now where every kind of action counts, big action counts. And I think the one thing I would say is, like, with a clock like that, you kind of need one for every day. It's almost in that zone now, because the other big thing with the 2030 target is, I mean, actually, before Biden did the 2030 target quite recently, even in this country, we're talking about, shall we get to net zero by 2050, which essentially allows the government to just go, yeah, we could do that. They still don't actually say that, but it allows them to go, yeah, we'll go to 2050, but it allows them to do pretty much nothing for the next 3 years. Actually, what we really need is very, very frequent, very clear targets over the coming decade, year by year, in order to really, nail what we need to nail. Because if you wait till 2030, you're going to be like, won't happen.
Definitely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I suppose it is that the countdown is counting down to a specific date, sure, but it is a representation of trying to evoke, alarm, and really trying to get people to understand that there is an end date. Doesn't matter what that date is, we have to act now. And it was really, I felt like this work visually really did help convey that, especially, the colour, the redness sort of spilling out over the gallery, and confronting the viewer first before they even saw the more kind of contemplative and kind of creative works. Yeah.
Well, Yandell, we might finish with your fourth and last artwork. It's called Connecting Systems, and it speaks of nature and technology. Can you extend on your intention for this work?
Yes, sure. This was a 10-channel video installation. It begun with an interest in the connection trees within a forest actually have with each other. So, that network that allows the trees to work together to communicate and support each other. But also interested in our connection and disconnection to plants and trees, to the natural environment. Personally, coming from far north Queensland, my dad lived in the Daintree rainforest when I grew up. So I was able to connect deeply to the natural environment through visiting him. So this installation is, a forest of digital trees, though. So it's really highlighting for me our increasing disconnection to the natural environment as we are experiencing this forest through screens. And we as humans are becoming more and more reliant on technology. Not only is that shifting our connection with each other, but it is, creating a further disconnect to the natural environment. These trees are also breathing. They've got, these human-like breathing sounds. And for me, that's kind of reminding us that the complex ecosystems of the world are fragile, and we're part of that. Our own existence is intertwined with that vulnerability. We need this as well. So, yeah.
We might bring Lisa back into the discussion as a...
I was just thinking that was reminding me then, I was thinking different things the first time I thought about that exhibit, but now you're reminding me of the Melbourne tree strategy, where they've actually named all of their trees in the city, and you can send a message to them, and as one means to try and connect people back to their city trees, and you can say hello, keep track of it, and the whole tree, and the way that cities are cataloging trees that are in cities so that we can make sure we're protecting them. And you can text into the councils to say if there's something bad happening to that tree. And I guess I didn't think I'd know the arborists as much as I do now, because arborists are really important in digitally marking those trees. But also, we've just rolled out some heat sensors in the city, and we're trying to measure the urban microclimates in the heat island. And it's really obvious in the city, because usually urban heat islands are measured at the airport, which is really silly because it's quite cool there compared to the city. But if you're standing right beside a tree, it's so much cooler. And I think we need to embrace that in how we live in the city. And so people do engage with nature. If you chop it all down and you put up the wrong things, then people aren't going to engage. So that technology-nature interface is, I think, something that you get across quite well in this piece.
Most people may not necessarily think of themselves as being particularly conservation-minded, but if they hear that a 200-year-old tree is about to be cut down by council down the road, all of a sudden you've got yourself an activist. What do you think it is about the urban environment that you can forget you're surrounded by nature, or you're within nature for a while, but
so
things can trigger it?
Yeah, one of the big projects that I'm working on is up at Smithfield Village, and I think I have a photo of that there. And it's a really amazing innovation in subdivision design, where the concrete drains have been replaced with vegetated drains and big bioswales and retention basins, so that all the stormwater will collect there and be cleaned before it goes out to the reef, right? But we just ran a survey through this neighborhood to ask the people living there, did they know what was going on, that this was a watershed and this was an innovation? And 5% of people knew what was going on here. And you thought, well, how can people not know? So I don't know how. I think using technology is really important, Yandell, and I don't think I've nailed it yet myself. I think it's so significant.
Well, I think actually, COVID has, of course, created for all of us a unique need to be connected. Here today with Zoom, it's allowing us to connect with Torres and Yandell for this. But the Great Reef Census is very much as you want people to have that tangible connection to the Great Barrier Reef, no one could travel here internationally to come see it for themselves and gain that connection and inspiration to want to care for it. Well, we connected with thousands of people around the world that felt, a connection through that imagery, feeling like they were doing their part. So I completely agree. And that's a hard thing I struggle with, of how do we kind of isolate technology to get that physical connection that we still need, but then still use it to our advantage to get the connection where it can't be. It just can't exist due to circumstance.
I mean, anytime we have conversations around climate change in the media, you'll have a certain percentage of our audience that will say, well, that's fine. We can get rid of coal-fired power stations, but how are the Greenies going to text people with their phones and, organise rallies with their computers? And people have there seems to be a kind of a perception that it's either one or the other in this debate. And it makes it difficult to actually bring people into the middle where you might be able to have a genuine discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's this sort of default to a black and white view of the world. I mean, talk about the reef, it's the same thing. You have incredible beauty and you have bits that are really not, that are really hammered, and you got bits in between that. It's not black and white. And I with the corona, with the pandemic, the Zoom thing and the disconnect between your family, if your family's abroad or if it's down in Melbourne or in, it's really tough. However, it means you also don't have to go and fly, which was just this expectation in Australia, particularly, that you would fly from city to city for a meeting. Just madness, But I actually thought this piece of art was the most beautiful and the most depressing, Yandell.
Yeah, well, Lucas, I was wondering whether you had a take on that. The digital trees replacing the real thing.
I love the artwork. But Yeah, I guess I found Yandell. I would like to ask: is there in the digital trees? They're beautiful and they're breathing or they're making breathing sounds. So, is there hope in the trees, or is it or is it kind of doom and gloom?
Yeah, well, as an artist, I don't have the answers. I'm only trying to provoke, discussion and thought. But what I can say is, firstly, I am utilising technology within my practice because it is really effective to connect to the viewer. I can create really immersive environments that are really inspiring, and they connect to a broad audience, which is really interesting because I'm also critiquing technology within the work. But this work, Connecting Systems, was such, I just have to briefly discuss how I created this work. It was through a lot of connecting to those trees. So within the natural environment, I chose a tree that really spoke to me, and I photographed that tree and took it to my studio and animated the texture of the tree, and then took that texture back, that video back, with a generator and a projector at night, projected it onto that tree and filmed that. So that's how I created that work. And it took a very long time to capture the perfect videos of these trees. And I had this very special solo experience creating this work over a very long period. So that's interesting in itself. The production of that work very much connected me to those trees in that area.
And Torres Webb, we might let you have the final say on this. Your impressions of the final piece from Yandell, and also, I guess, the technology element to your work as an educator and an advocate for science.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like many others here on the panel, also having a look and seeing that art piece, it's a real reality. It's a real reality check that this is where we're heading, and what we're going to be experiencing and seeing here in Australia, in our backyard in far north Queensland, is climate refugees. And we don't do something about that. And for our urban plan and design, where to next for our communities up there? So it's really it's a very, very important issue for our communities up in the far north, and particularly in the Torres Strait. With regards to the technology, and like others have shared, it's about how can we utilize that technology to connect people back to that natural environment, and rather than separating. So it is definitely something of very much importance, and particularly for, if I'm talking for the Torres Strait region, people's sense of belonging and sense of home, and really could really undermine and take away that identity for people. How we can use technology to better connect people to the natural environment, I think doesn't have to be black and white. It can be both and.
Do you see a role for virtual reality? I know it's a bit beyond what we're discussing today, but I mean, some people are quite worried about virtual reality replacing the real thing. You can take virtual reality tours of the reef, I think, at the moment, and through the rainforest. Torres, what do you think about the pros and cons, I guess, of becoming reliant on virtual reality for our experiences of nature?
I think that we can find the benefits within that virtual reality. And I know of the fantastic work that some of our Uruganji rangers are actually utilizing virtual reality to connect people to experience and see the beauty of the region, to really promote that. Utilizing virtual reality, I think, can be a great tool to really extend out to the wider public and people who may not be able to visit, to see this beauty that we have here in our natural environment in far north Queensland, and to celebrate it and to really look after it.
It's incredible, isn't it? You think you go to an art gallery and you can have a look at a piece of art yourself, or maybe have a conversation with the person next to you. But today we've been able to get the input of 5 people from very different backgrounds and had a lot of conversation around 4 incredible pieces of art from Yandell. So we might wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your participation. Yandell Walton, thank you so much for the art that stimulated so much of the discussion.
All right, thank you. I just also want to say thanks, Northside, for organising this. It was, I just feel so honoured to have a panel of experts sort of unpacking the themes that came sort of very intuitively to me. So thank you. It was amazing to hear all of you talk.
And thank you very much to our panellists tonight, Katie Chartrand, Lisa Law, Lucas Cernusak, Andy Ridley and Torres Webb. Thank you very much for being part of the discussion.
Thank you.